For a while now, I've been looking for a medium-speed black and white film that is suitable for very well-lit situations. Sometimes I just want to work with shallow depth of field, and I want a film that works really well for portraits outdoors, as well as other types of photography that I personally enjoy, like nature photography and some macro photography. And I was looking for a film stock that delivered extremely high sharpness, as well as a wide tonal range, but also delivered excellent contrast and had a bit of character. I've tried a couple of different film stocks, and one that I ran across by chance, which is Rollei Retro 80S, is probably my favorite, and this is probably also one of the most unique film stocks on the market today, and it's not very expensive either. Now, if you've spent any amount of time in the analog photography world, then the name Rollei probably sounds somewhat familiar to you, and that's because the company is most well known for making their Rollei Flex and Rollei Cord cameras, those twin lens reflex cameras that look fantastic and actually are fantastic cameras themselves as well. But they also develop a line of film stocks, and they are owned by the Belgian film company Agfa. And Retro 80S is based off of an aerial film developed by Agfa, so for technical applications. It's a super panchromatic film with near infrared sensitivity, so that means beyond the usual panchromatic color response spectrum that something like Delta 100 from Ilford is capable of capturing, you have a bit more sensitivity in the red regions, which actually makes for some very unique results when it comes to portraiture. The film was developed to have an incredibly high sharpness and resolving power, meaning that the images that come off of this film stock are incredibly detailed. And, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is one of the less expensive film stocks on the market right now, even if it isn't always as available as other options. I exposed several rolls of Retro 80S in various cameras, including my Olympus Pen F and my Pentax cameras, and I developed it in Ilford ID11 using my Patterson tank by hand, one roll at a time. I developed it at 20 degrees for 12.5 minutes. I inverted for the first 30 seconds after pouring the developer in, which is my usual process. Later, when I was looking at the technical specifications for the film to make this video, I read that Rollei actually recommends inverting for the first 60 seconds. I had no issues inverting for the first 30, and then I inverted for 10 seconds, 10 inversions every minute. After that, I used a water stop bath, and then I fixed the film in Ilford Rapid Fix. After it had dried off, I scanned it using my Fujifilm X-T2 and converted all of the images to a positive using Negative Lab Pro inside of Adobe Lightroom. The film was fairly easy to handle. The film base is quite thin. It's a lot thinner than other film stocks that I've handled. I was basically concerned that the film was going to be a little bit delicate and that I might rip it or tear it as I was loading it into the Patterson tank for development, and I didn't end up having any issues with it. One thing that did stick out to me as I was finishing up with the development of this film, after having fixed it, I was doing the final wash, and the water came out very blue. I was surprised at how blue it was, and it took a lot more washing to get the wash water at the end, wow, that's a tongue twister, to come out completely clear and clean. And even after that, when I pulled the negatives out of the Patterson tank to hang them to dry, the base still had a bit of a blue tint to it. However, once it dried off to be crystal clear. I've never handled a film where the negative base is this clear. It was very surprising to me. Maybe there are lots of film stocks that look like this, but this was my first experience with a film base that is this clear. Now, the very first thing that struck me when I took a look at these negatives, after converting them to a positive on my computer, was the absolute insane amount of clarity in the images. Not only was the film base itself crystal clear, the actual images that come off the negative are incredibly clear, and that's down to the fact that this film has a very, very high resolving power. Rollei actually puts that as one of their main key features of this film stock is the amount of resolution that you have, the amount of detail that can be captured in a single image. Film also has quite a bit of character when it comes to the contrast in the film. It's not as contrast perhaps some other films like Ferrania P30, which I consider to be the king of contrast, but those two films, Rollei and P30, aren't really comparable. But Retro 80S has a beautiful amount of contrast. I would consider it a fairly high amount of contrast. In terms of exposure latitude on this film, it is advertised as being fairly high, but you have to beware when metering for this film because the highlights and the shadows can quickly lose detail if you're not exposing properly in high contrast lighting environments. Another thing to take note of with this film is the very, very fine grain. It's almost undetectable in the images that I took. Even in underexposed areas, the grain is incredibly fine. The images are also very, very sharp. In addition to the high amount of clarity and resolution in the images, there's also a good amount of sharpness. Earlier in the summer, I was doing some not really macro photography, but I was certainly trying to capture some photos of different insects that we had around in the gardens here, and I was impressed with the amount of detail that came back when I took a look at those negatives of the various insects, bees, as well as dragonflies that I was taking photos of. And some of these were even done with my Olympus Pen F, and even in those photos, the grain is almost invisible and the sharpness and clarity very, very high. Now let's take a moment to talk about the increased red sensitivity and what that means when you're actually taking pictures. One thing where you're going to notice it is portraits. When it comes to rendering skin tones, there's going to be an increased tonality and an increased smoothness in the tonality when it comes to rendering skin tones if you're using Retro 80S. I absolutely love the way that this film renders images, and it's quickly becoming one of my favorite film stocks just because it has a lot of character while still delivering very high resolution images. In terms of the shooting experience using Rollei Retro 80S, I treated it just like I would any other black and white film at this film speed. I've seen a lot of people talk about using it with filters, and I think this is a film that can create some very unique results with filters, but I didn't use any. I just treated it just like any other films that I would that is at this speed, and it worked fantastically. Now the ISO of 80 is going to mean that you're going to have to use it in situations where you have a lot of light available. I wouldn't maybe use this for natural light photography indoors, but for outdoor photography, this is going to do incredibly well. I used it for a lot of nature shots, as you've seen so far throughout this video, as well as a bit of landscape photography and portraiture, and those are areas where this particular film really does well. One thing to note is that after I got the images back onto the computer from the very first roll that I exposed, I took great care to make sure that I was metering much more precisely than I did with the first roll, just so that I could make sure that I was getting the maximum out of this film. I would say that while this film does have a fairly wide exposure latitude, I would think it's very important that with this particular film stock that you nail your exposure, just because the detail in those whites and those blacks can quickly disappear on you. If I'm going to be honest, I can recommend Rollei Retro 80S to anyone who is looking for a medium speed black and white film with a bit of character. I see this as a fantastic film for those among you who are looking for a film that is capable of rendering very, very high detail images. For example, I can see it working very well for things like macro photography. And as an added bonus, the film is also not very expensive, making it even easier to recommend. I love Retro 80S, and it's definitely going to find its way into my workflow as one of the film stocks that I'm going to work with on a regular basis. The images that come off it are absolutely fantastic. I love the way they look. I love the character that this film has. If you can find some in stock somewhere, I recommend that you try it if you haven't already. It is an absolutely gorgeous film to work with. That's all that I have to say for now. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video if you think I've deserved it, subscribe if you think I've earned it, and I will see you next time.